Welcome to KOIN Conversations. I'm Lisa Balick, and my guest today is Dr. Monique Udell, who is a professor at Oregon State University and director of the Human-Animal Interaction Lab there. Dr. Udell, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're going to talk today about your most recent study about cats and humans and emotions. Explain a little bit about this research that's been published. What were you looking at, and tell us exactly what you did in the research study.
Sure. So the most recent study was really focused on human perception of cat emotion. And what we were interested in is understanding what kind of information did people use when making assessments about the emotions in the cats that they're seeing. So that might be their own cats or other cats that they encounter in their daily lives. So what we did is we took images of cats and we imposed them on different backgrounds, either indoor or outdoor backgrounds. The cats were paired, so we had the same image 2 times in the survey, sometimes on that indoor background, sometimes on the outdoor. And then we had people rate their perception of the cat's emotional state, so positive or negative, their level of arousal, so are they very awake and active, or are they kind of on the slower, more tired end? And then separately, later, we had them rate their own emotion in response to the cat. So we could understand how their own emotions and also how contextual cues like background influence their perception of the cat's emotional state.
What was the purpose of the study?
Yeah, so the purpose of the study was to try to understand if people are utilizing other things other than the cat's actual behavior to guide their beliefs about how well a cat might be doing in its environment or their emotional state in that environment. And what we found is that this is actually true. So we know that on average, people are not great at accurately identifying their animal's emotional state. And this has gone equally true in the past in studies looking at people's perception of cat emotion. And what we found is that if people perceived the cat as having more positive emotion, if they saw them in certain areas, so like if they saw them in an indoor background, people also saw cats as having a more positive emotional state when they were feeling more positive emotions, which suggests that we're using this external information to guide our perception. And this is really important because we use these perceptions about how a cat is feeling, whether they're accurate or not, to guide the decision making that we have in our day-to-day interactions with the cat, or when deciding whether the cat might need medical care or whether it's enriched enough in its environment. And so understanding the kinds of things that we're using to guide this perspective and our choices in our interactions with cats can help us ultimately provide better care for cats and hopefully also improve their welfare and our relationship with them.
What did you find relative to the backgrounds of the cats?
Yeah, so what was really interesting is that whether or not people believed cats should be allowed to go freely outdoors, on average, people perceived cats' emotional state as higher when they were pictured in an indoor background, or more positive when they were pictured in an indoor background, as opposed to when they were pictured on an outdoor background, which is really fascinating. That doesn't necessarily mean that that is where the cat feels happiest. That's not what the study was looking at, but that we have this cultural perception of cats as potentially being in a more positive emotional state when they're indoors was kind of interesting. We also found that in general, if we're looking at these different features, there were other things that were potentially influencing guiding response, not just the background. We also looked at coat color, and we saw some interesting relationships there. Interestingly enough, contrary to some prior studies, we found that people perceived cats with their darker coat colors as actually experiencing a higher, more positive emotional state, which is interesting because in past research, we've sometimes seen different things. And so it might mean that our perceptions of different cats are changing over time as well. So it's not just, how we feel about cats is influenced by these contextual cues in static ways, but that perceptions can change over time. But these perceptions may not have as much to do with the cat's actual behavior as they do about other cues that we're taking in at the same time.
For example, black cats. People used to think that, black cats, they're kind of maybe a little people get a little uncomfortable. They might feel that they're not as warm as a different colored cat. You're saying that research shows differently at this point?
So, there's a variety of kind of research that you can do on perception of different features. And historically, black cats have been associated with a lot of myths and biases and stories and fairy tales where sometimes they're not always given sort of the best roles in those situations. And I think there's been a big shift in that, like recognition that the stories that we tell and the perceptions that we have about animals can impact their well-being. They can impact adoptability and how we decide to bring them into our homes and raise them. And so there's been a lot of work over the years to sort of correct that and provide information to people. And possibly that what this means is that it's working, that we're actually starting to shift our perception of some of these biases away from that, and recognize that the positive qualities in all of these animals. The challenge, though, is that we're still overestimating positive emotion in cats overall, which suggests that we may sometimes be apt to miss indicators that a cat isn't experiencing the best welfare or may not be healthy, or feel comfortable in a situation. So ideally, we want to provide education that provides an accurate assessment of the cat's body language so we can make good decisions based on the cat, how the cat's really feeling. And this research suggests we have maybe a little ways to go with that. But as we learn about the kinds of things that can distract us and change our perception, we can provide better education about it.
You talk about perception versus reality, where we're still trying to read animals trying to read us a little bit better. People talk to their animals as if they're people, and a lot of times they say, oh, they do understand what I'm conveying. In this case, though, it seems that there's a real separation, though, between perception but really not knowing reality. In other words, you are saying that people might think that a cat is enjoying being inside more than being outside, but you don't really know.
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to is just sort of our gut feeling about things and the things that we've been taught to believe about cats versus making sure that people, especially those that are caregiving for cats, have access to information that helps them make accurate assessments. And so it's not that people can't learn how to interpret their cat's behavior or emotional state more accurately. We know that with training and education, they can absolutely do that. And many cat caregivers want to. But it's really about getting the information out there that sometimes our gut feelings about maybe our beliefs about what cats and dogs are feeling may not always be accurate. And that's what the research is suggesting, that if we just sort of put people in this situation and we ask them without any sort of training, we're not seeing that these perceptions are always mapping on to features of the animal. Even if we're looking at the same animal, the same picture, and we're just changing the background, we can see that perception change. So we know that there's some other factors here that are influencing our perceptions. So I think the key is just the awareness of that, the awareness that we may not always be accurate now, but we have the potential to improve, and that can solidify and help strengthen the bond is a really powerful thing. Hopefully it compels people to want to get better at understanding their animals and their emotions.
What surprised you in the research compared to perhaps perceptions you had going in of what people would say or think?
Yeah, so when we originally designed the study, we were aware of the fact that there's differing views on beliefs about things like whether cats should be allowed freely outdoors. There's lots of reasons for that. And so we were kind of taking this not from the approach of, which is right or wrong or how does that impact the cat, but again, how are these environments going to affect different individuals' perceptions of the cat's emotional state? What we thought going in is that people who believed that cats should be kept indoors would actually perceive a more positive emotional state in the cats when they saw them pictured indoors, and that people that believe that cats should go outdoors, we expected that they would perceive a more positive emotional state outdoors. But that's not actually what we found. Instead, what we found is that sort of across the board, on average, there was this perception that cats were experiencing a more positive emotional state when they were pictured indoors, sort of universally. And so that raises some interesting questions and also gives us some food for thought when we're thinking about How are people making decisions about cats, and how are they perceiving them in these different environments? And again, importantly, this isn't necessarily a test of how the cat actually feels in this case. Same cat pictured on two different backgrounds, but our perceptions do matter in the way that we raise and care for animals. And so the fact that some of these things sort of go against our expectations is interesting and helps improve that understanding.
I don't know if you take a look at the research on the animals themselves, not the human-animal interaction, but does some of that match up with any kind of research that's been done strictly on the animals?
Yeah, so there is research that's been done on animals looking at how well they respond to human behavior and human emotional state. So that's one area that's kind of interesting. In some cases, animals, if we look at just the sheer percentage of animals that respond accurately to indicators of our emotional state or our behavior, they actually perform sometimes even at higher levels than people, which sounds surprising and interesting. But also, if we think about the fact that this information is so relevant to the animals under our care, right? They have to come to us for most of the things, if not all of the things that they need in their life. So being able to read our body language, to be able to predict when we're likely to provide those things to them and when we're not available is critically important. Whereas as much as we love our animals, we can get the things that we need in our day-to-day life ourselves. We aren't dependent on our animals for those things. And so when we pay attention to our animals, it's a choice that we're making out of love for our animals, not out of this dependence. And so I think we have to be more thoughtful and proactive about making that choice. Whereas for our animals, especially the ones living fully under our care, this is just something that's a critical, really important part of their lives. And so maybe it comes a little bit quicker. So that I think that's kind of an interesting thing that we can look at when we're comparing those two scenarios.
And this research was strictly on this indoor-outdoor comparison, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the experimental part was, so we actually manipulated the background images, but from that we can also ask questions about things like coat color. We can also ask things about prior experience with cats. So we did ask other questions, but the one that we had the most control over was the background.
When you look at, the research, where do you see it being able to be used, where it might be helpful? Because some people would say, well, you project sort of your thoughts on what you think the cat is thinking, but you don't really know what the cat's thinking. So how would this be useful in terms of, day-to-day or in certain businesses or certain areas?
Yeah, so one of the ways that it's really useful is understanding what it means when we're reporting about our cat's behavior. Because we do research that directly looks at the animal. We've worked with the animal hands-on. We can allow them to make choices and figure out what they want and need. But sort of another way that we sometimes evaluate animal needs or animal behavior is by asking people who care for them, or asking the owners, after this experience or with this food or with this toy, how does your cat feel? Is your cat experiencing positive emotion? And when we do this kind of research and we find out that our perceptions may not always be telling us exactly what the animal is feeling in that moment, but might be more reflective of our experience of that event to give us positive emotion. That provides useful information to us, but it's different. It's a different kind of information. So it might mean, for example, when we're looking at survey studies where people are reporting on their cat's behavior, we have to take that with a grain of salt unless they were specifically trained to report on those aspects of the behavior, because we know our own personal perceptions may actually be coloring what we're saying about our cats. And so it raises the need for more research that directly asks the animals through behavioral assessments, through choice, what it is that they want and need in that moment. And then we can use that information to match up to what people are saying about their perceptions of that behavior and help them get better at identifying those needs.
One thing I was thinking of in terms of perhaps usage is, let's say at adoption agencies, humane society, rescues, that the pictures of the animals, it might influence whether or not they are adopted or what the perception is from somebody seeing that image of the animals. Could it be used perhaps in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think that there's that element too, right? When we're thinking about, what kind of images might give people the most positive emotion or might make them perceive the animal as being in a better welfare state, then we have this indicator that at least for cats, that might be an image on an indoor background, right? And this is research that's been done in other species, so it can vary based on our cultural perceptions of what different species need. And so we have research on, other species that might say, maybe for dogs it's different. Maybe we need them on a different background, engaged in a different kind of activity. So yeah, we can use this information about how people perceive these images to guide our choices of images when we're using it for marketing or for communication. But ultimately, hopefully, it will get people closer and closer to being able to read that behavior so we can more accurately communicate either through images and video or in person what they're actually seeing in the animal itself as opposed to what the background story is telling them.
It's interesting because a lot of people are encouraged to take your cat outside. Your cat needs to be outside, needs some fresh air, in a carrier or, different ways to expose your cat outside. But often people, I hear, they say, well, when I take the animal outside, they don't want anything to do with the outside. And we've tried repeatedly and it just doesn't happen. So is this maybe some research that shows that maybe perhaps it's okay if your cat is indicating really don't want to be outside and, the feeling is like, well, maybe that's what you need to hear?
Yeah, I think that paying attention to what the animal is saying, if you have an animal that's just really not interested in going outside, it's been raised indoors, it has lots of enrichment indoors, and outside causes stress, that's being attentive to that individual's preferences. And absolutely, individuals have preferences. I think, for thinking about cats as a broader group of animals, plenty of cats do want to go outdoors and enjoy being outdoors. There's lots of enriching things that cats could potentially do if you take them out on a leash or give them supervised opportunities outdoors. And there's trade-offs, right? There's risks to going outdoors. But these are animals that, evolved to be outdoors. And so certainly there's lots of enriching things in the environment. And there's ways of potentially providing that enrichment that also help protect the animal and protect that environment. So I certainly wouldn't say this research should discourage those sorts of activities. We actually do work in our lab to help people get that access in safe, secure ways for them and their cats if that's something that they want to do. But it does suggest that it might help us understand why maybe we feel a little less compelled to do things like leash training with our cats compared to our dogs. For dogs, it's considered almost expected in our culture today that we're going to leash train them and we're going to get them outdoors, even if they live indoors. And we don't always feel that way about cats. And this might explain why, that maybe we're perceiving cats as feeling differently about being in that indoor environment than we perceive dogs. And also that awareness that that perception may or may not always be accurate is important because it allows us to make more educated decisions about how we're going to enrich the lives of our animals. And for some people, that might mean giving outdoor visits a try if it's safe for them to do so with their animal and they can do it in a safe, protective way.
What prompted your research in this particular area in the first place?
Yeah, so part of it is just this question of, what is it that people are perceiving when they're looking at their animals? We're really interested in improving bonds between animals and people and improving the welfare of animals and their partnerships with people. We know that humans benefit a lot from, or have the potential to benefit a lot from having animals in their lives, and that animals have the potential to benefit from that relationship as well, as long as it's a good, strong relationship. And so it started really out of this passion to find ways to make that relationship stronger. But one of the factors there is understanding the perceptions that already exist, because it's hard to provide suggestions for how we can make those bonds stronger if we don't know sort of the perspective of both individuals coming to the table, sort of what the animal's needs and choices would be given those choices and how the humans are perceiving that situation and what their perceptions and choices might be. So this is part of that package, is understanding how people view the world and the animals in it now. So we can maybe educate and provide changes that increase the likelihood of positive outcomes for both the human and the animal.
I have to ask you, since you do a lot of animal research there at Oregon State University, is there any information or advice that you have based on your research for cat owners? Because cats often are rather mysterious. Dogs, pretty much, for the most part, are pretty easy to read. Cats are really a mysterious group of animals, I think, for a lot of people. And people think they may know them, or they're not sure, or they're still learning over time. Is there anything that you've learned through the research that helps people better understand a cat?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the awareness, right? I think if you're coming into a situation saying, "I would love to know more about my cat, but I recognize that I don't know enough or that I'm having trouble reading in their body language," that's actually a really great starting point, because what the research suggests is a lot of people struggle with these things, and having the awareness that you want to improve and areas that you can improve is a good step towards actually making those changes to learning what you need to learn. I think if you want to build the bond with a cat or understand cats better, recognizing that cats have incredible potential, both socially and cognitively. They're very smart. They can be trained. They do form strong, secure social bonds with companions. They have that potential. And so even just the awareness that there's so many possibilities with cats, and we often underestimate just how much cats can do. So I would encourage anyone who wants to build that bond, go out and get a training book. Spend time just watching your cat, seeing what your cat likes to do, what their preferences are, showing that warmth and that attention. We've seen even the research there, individuals who attend to their cat, even over a couple of minutes, see a dramatic increase in their cat's sociability towards them compared to those that are sort of going about their day, assuming that the cat doesn't need that attention or that reciprocal attention. So I think the more we invest in our relationships with our cats and understanding cats, the stronger that bond can be, and also the better outcome for the cat.
Dr. Monique Udell, researcher at Oregon State University, head of the Human Interaction and Human-Animal Interaction Lab. Thanks for joining us on KOIN Conversations. We'll reconnect with you on dogs in maybe a few weeks. Thanks.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.